I'm at the moment of regret.
Hey, I'm Erin from Refurbished Dish, and I'm going to show you how to strip paint off a piece of mid-century modern furniture and restore it back to its original beauty. I found this dresser on Facebook Marketplace, and I probably overpaid for it. I paid $80 for it, but I could not stop thinking about what could be under the paint. So I'm going to take you through the entire process of how to refinish a piece of furniture like this, and if you're a beginner, that's perfect because I'm going to take it step by step. The first step is going to be to prep your workspace. Stripping paint is super messy, and you want to be able to clean it up quickly. I like to use this craft paper and painter's tape. It's a little bit more eco-friendly, but you could definitely use a plastic tarp instead. Once my space has been prepped, I'm going to move on to removing all of the hardware. I usually like to clean my pieces before I work on them, but the stripping process is basically like one big deep clean, so I'm not going to worry about it this time. Next, I'm going to remove all of the drawers. I find that the stripper penetrates better whenever it's sitting on a flat surface. I'm using Green Easy to strip this piece. This is my go-to furniture stripper. It works consistently well every time, whether it's paint or stain or anything like that. You want to give it a good shake and then just apply it liberally with a cheap chip brush. After about a half an hour, the top looked like this and was ready to scrape. This is by far one of the most satisfying parts of the process, but also one of the scariest because you never know what you're going to find underneath paint. I was really hoping for walnut underneath this, but I got mahogany, but that's okay. Mahogany is still a beautiful wood. When you're stripping paint, always make sure to go with the grain. If there are spots that are a little bit tough to remove, like this one here, don't worry about it. Just reapply the stripper, let it sit for a little bit longer, and go back and remove it. Stripping areas with curves and details like this is definitely challenging, but once I get the bulk of the paint off, I go in with my bristle brush and I just try to scrub as much as I can out. It's gonna look messy at this point, but try not to worry about it too much because we're gonna get the rest of the remnants of paint off later. Once the bulk of the paint has been removed, I go in with my Green Easy Finishing Cleaner. This is basically just a heavy duty degreaser that is going to remove any remnants of paint, finish, and residue from the stripper. I like to fully saturate the surface, scrub that in, and then scrape with my paint scraper. And then I repeat that process and wipe it until it's clean. Making sure that you're removing all of the residue is super important because if you skip this step, the leftover paint and residue from the stripper will clog your sander and it can affect your finish down the line. Next, I move on to the details, and I'm not going to lie to you, this is usually where I start to lose motivation.
I'm at the moment of regret.
If you've ever stripped furniture before, I want to know what your least favorite part is because this is mine. With that being said, and this may just be sheer delusion on my part, once I step back and see that beautiful final result, I magically forget how much this sucked. Once the entire piece has been scrubbed clean and I wait for it to dry, I move on to cleaning up my workspace. I get a lot of questions about how to clean up the paint once it's stripped and how to dispose of it, and the answer to that really depends on the product that you're using and your state's regulations. The stripper that I use doesn't have any of what my state considers hazardous waste, so once it's dry, I just dispose of it in the regular trash. I decided that I'm going to stain this piece, so I'm going to go over one more time with mineral spirits just to make sure it's squeaky clean before I sand. If you're going to be using any water-based products, do not use mineral spirits, use soap and water instead. I'm doing my first initial sanding with 120 grit. This is all veneer, which basically means that it's just a thin sheet of real wood, so you have to be really careful to not burn through it. Burn through is basically when you sand too far through that first layer of veneer to reveal the substrate underneath, and it's really hard to fix. You can avoid burn through by keeping your sander moving, going really lightly on the edges, and not applying pressure to your sander. I also wouldn't recommend going any lower than 120 grit. On a detailed drawer like this, I honestly would recommend hand sanding unless you're really comfortable with the sander because there are so many different edges that it would be really easy to burn through those areas. You could definitely start with a higher grit like 220. If you're not comfortable, just keep in mind it'll take a little bit longer. Once all of the flat surfaces have been sanded, I moved on to using my Pro Foam pad from Surfprep on all of the curved areas to get the rest of the finish off. Paying attention to the detailed areas that may still have paint is really important important when you're staining, especially if it's white paint. After I sanded, I thoroughly inspected the piece to make sure I didn't miss any areas of paint. I noticed that there was still some paint stuck in the grain after I sanded, so when that happens, I like to use acetone and a bristle brush to scrub those areas and remove the paint. It may seem like overkill, but I promise you, I've skipped this step and later regretted it because the white paint is so glaringly obvious once it's stained. Acetone is excellent to use for smaller areas like this, but I wouldn't use it on an entire piece because it dries almost immediately and it's pretty toxic. So make sure you're wearing the proper PPE when you use it. Don't drive yourself crazy with this step because it's virtually impossible to remove every tiny speck of paint, but you definitely want to do your due diligence to make sure you're trying to get out as much paint out of the grain as possible. Before my final sanding, I'm going to use my favorite adult Play-Doh to fix any damage that I came across while sanding. This can be a little tough to work with. You definitely want to use a press and smooth out method, and it will feel like it's not sticking, but I promise you, this stuff adheres super well and it dries rock hard. Once that dries, I sand it down smooth with 120 grit, and don't worry, we'll come back to this and I'll show you how to blend everything in after we stain. Next, I sand everything down with 220 grit, making sure to look out for any swirl marks and smooth those out because they'll definitely show through your stain. My final step before stain is to wipe everything down with mineral spirits again to make sure I have a smooth, clean, dust-free surface to work with. Every stain looks different on different types of wood species, so I'm going to be testing out 3 stains to see which color I like best. They're all gel stains, and I personally prefer gel stains because they're easier to work with and they're easier to fix if you mess them up. The difference between gel stain and penetrative stain is that gel stain sits on the surface of the wood, whereas penetrative stain absorbs into the wood. I really like this aged oak stain, so I'm going to use that one. The key to successfully using gel stain is to apply it in a thick, even layer and then wipe it off after 1 to 3 minutes. If you're in a really hot and humid climate like I am, it tends to dry way quicker, so make sure to wipe it back before it starts to dry. If you do notice that it starts to dry before you get a chance to wipe it off, just apply another layer right on top before wiping and then wipe it back. I am loving how the stain is coming out, but it needs to dry for 24 hours, so while I wait for it to dry, I'm going to clean up my workspace. If you haven't listened to anything so far, please listen to this because it could save someone's life. When you're disposing of your stain rags, make sure you either soak them in water or lay them flat to dry. Oil-based stain releases heat as it oxidizes, and when they're crumbled in a pile together, the heat has nowhere to go and they can potentially ignite. Make sure you're not skipping this step because you do not want to burn your house down. It's been 24 hours, my stain is fully dry, so it's time to move on to top coating. I'm using a wipe-on polyurethane and I love this top coat. It's super beginner friendly, it levels beautifully, and it leaves a really pretty satin sheen. For the first coat, I pour it directly on the surface and I do a little bit of a lighter coat, making sure that my final pass is with smooth, even strokes. Now that we've stained and added the first layer of top coat, it's time to color match that repair. This part can seem super intimidating, but it's really trust the process technique and honestly one of my favorite parts of the whole process. I'm using Mohawk blend all sticks for this, and I'm just basically applying several layers of different colors and blending them with my finger to try and get the right color match. Now that I have a base layer down, I'm going to go in with my sprayable lacquer to seal that in before I add another layer. If not, it will just continue to smudge and you won't be able to blend the colors evenly. The key to this process is a lot of color theory and a lot of layers. Now I'm going to go through with a darker shade to kind of replicate the shadow of the wood grain. Natural wood grain has a lot of variation, so pay attention to the lights and darks of the surrounding areas and try your best to replicate that with your blend all sticks. I'm sealing this one last time with lacquer before I go in with a really light coat of toner. The toner is going to help blend the colors a little bit more seamlessly. You'll want to seal the toner in between layers just like you will the blend all sticks. A really important tip that has helped me in this process is to take a step back and look at the area that you're blending from far away. Sometimes it can look great up close, but when you step back, you notice the color's a little bit off, so that's why it's important to do that. After giving that some time to dry, I do one more light layer of toner, one more light layer of lacquer, and make some last minute color changes with blend all sticks, making sure to seal afterwards with the lacquer. By the way, if at any point in this process you feel like you've messed up and you want to start over, you can lightly sand this off with 220 grit, or you can use lacquer thinner to remove it and start over. I am absolutely loving the color match on this, but there's just one more thing that it needs to make it look hyper realistic. I like to add in wood grain lines elements with a furniture touch-up marker to make it blend even more. Full disclosure, I haven't perfected this process yet, and I'm still looking for a better way to get tiny little hairline strokes. You'll notice that I added some lines on too thick, and to fix this, I just dipped a towel in mineral spirits and gently wiped it away. I also like to go through with lacquer and seal periodically throughout this process. Finally, I add one more light layer of toner, one more light layer of lacquer, and this is how it looks now. Before applying my next layer of top coat, I noticed that the legs and the handles of the dresser were made out of a different wood species. Even though they were stained, they still remain a different color. I'm not personally a fan of this, so to fix this, I'm going to use a sprayable toner. Toner is basically just a clear finish with dye or pigment added, and it's used to blend wood tones and help them match. You want to do really light coats of this and multiple if needed to achieve the color that you're looking for. Make sure that you seal this with a sprayable lacquer before applying any type of paint on or wipe on top coat. After that dries, it's finally time to add the last few layers of top coat. I like to do 3 layers in total of this top coat, and I very lightly sand with 320 grit in between each coat to remove any texture and get the smoothest finish possible. And just like the stain rags, you want to make sure you either soak or lay these flat to dry. Moving on to the hardware, I did scrub them with steel wool and Brasso, but I really didn't like how they came out, so I ended up spray painting them. While the hardware dried, I moved on to giving the entire piece one last thorough clean and then got started on conditioning all of the drawers. I like to use a scented furniture salve on all of the drawer sides and then all the drawers themselves inside and out. I never skip this step on any of my pieces because it really does make such a huge difference on how well the drawers slide and then leaves the entire piece looking and smelling really fresh. Finally, I conditioned the last drawer, attached the hardware. Here's one more reminder of where we started. And here's what it looks like now.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. If you like watching furniture makeovers and restorations like this, feel free to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.